Three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuele, my good friend, Dr. William Rajbar. I'm out here in California. Will's out in the Canadian Rockies. We're still doing podcasts together, even though we're a whole country apart now, trying to find the grand and unified theory of human movement and biomechanics. Today, we're going to be talking about a cool, couple of different concepts that we've been really fascinated by. We're going to start by sharing an Instagram post that sparked a discussion between Will and I in the DMs. This is from Fowler_fitness_SPT on Instagram. He had a post that said, saying that lifting is going to destroy your gait cycle is like saying heel striking more when you walk is going to ruin your sprint mechanics. If you look at his comments here, he says the ironic part is that there's actually probably somewhere out there saying exactly that. Different goal, different mechanical and neurological input, different self-organizational strategy, different adaptation, different outcome. Makes sense. I also love it when people use the said principle to try and argue this point when the imposed demands are literally not the same. Do it for the algorithm and tag some salty go to boys below. So this sparked a conversation about what the said principle actually is. What happens to your body when you adapt to an imposed demand, and if it has consequences for how adapted you are for other demands. And Will and I talked a lot about this. We want to talk a little bit about how we feel he might be misinterpreting the said principle and how he's kind of almost disproving his own point in this post. But right off the get-go, Will, you had some really cool perspectives on this. Did you want to dive right into this?
Yeah, this is very, very interesting, and it brings up a lot of ideas that come up a lot with, our niche, biomechanics, and the lifting niche, right? Because I feel right now we're trying to merge the two, or a lot of people are trying to find where the common ground is. So yeah, anyway, let's dive into it. The part where he's like, there's a different goal, and we're talking between squats and running. Different goal, different mechanical and neurological input, true. Different self-organizational strategy, true. Different adaptation, different outcome, all true, right? We're in agreement here. Mm-hmm. Then it goes on to say, I love it when people use the said principle to try to argue the point. The imposed demands are literally not the same. And that's kind of the point that I would make as well, except exactly opposite of what he's saying. Mm-hmm. Because you're literally adapting to squats. You're adapting to squatting. And it is not the same as running. So your imposed demands within your own body, the internal variables are going to be completely different. So we really have to parse out what the positive adaptations to squatting are towards running and the negative adaptations. We need to bring this down a level to, is it good or bad? And let's actually see what type of lifting you're doing and what type of adaptations that's making. Are they positive or negative?
Well, just as a ground basis for people listening, the said principle is specific adaptations to imposed demands. As in, you have a specific imposed demand, and your body specifically adapts to deal with that demand. Like you're creating adaptations to have your body basically handle a stressor, an external stressor, more efficiently and more effectively, right? So when you're squatting, you have structural adaptations, you have neurological adaptations, and just so that you can perform a task better, if that makes sense. And what he's saying is that because the imposed demands are not the same within squatting and within the gait cycle, that you'll adapt better to lifting, but you won't have negative adaptations to your gait cycle. I think that's what he's saying. What do you think he's saying? Are you kind of getting the same thing?
So the first thing that he says, like the actual post, saying that lifting is going to destroy your gait cycle, okay, following so far, is like saying heel striking more when you walk is going to ruin your sprint mechanics. It's literally the exact, that really doesn't even make sense to me, to be honest. I never say that. I haven't heard anyone actually say that. People are saying that certain types of lifting, heels down, too much of a compressive load, the fact that your hips don't move, the fact that you have to brace your core, the fact that they're literally different neurological demands will at some point have no carryover. Okay. You are going to get better at lifting at some point when you're lifting. The question is, where is the sweet spot? If you claim there's an actual sweet spot where you're going to get adaptations from squatting into running, where is that sweet spot and where does it end? Otherwise, the best power lifters would be the best runners. True?
You would assume so, right? But like here he's saying different goal, different mechanical and neurological input, different self-organizational strategy, different adaptation, different outcome.
Yeah, true.
You know, that it feels like it's funny because it feels like his caption is almost defying the point that he's making in the tweet that he posted. You know,
It
saying
is.
that lifting is going to destroy your gait cycle is like saying heel striking more when you walk is going to ruin your sprint mechanics. Like I understand that what he's trying to say is walking and sprinting are not the same mechanically, therefore lifting and running or lifting in the gait cycle are not the same mechanically. Therefore, the adaptations that you have in lifting won't affect the adaptations you have in your gait cycle. And it's interesting because I asked Alex Viada, who is a powerlifting ultramarathon runner, if he has different considerations for how the neurological inputs of lifting would affect his gait cycle. And he said, hey, look, at the end of the day, you're doing thousands upon thousands of repetitions when you're running versus the handful of repetitions that you're going to be doing while you're lifting. So mechanically or neurologically you're going to get more input from the run because of just sheer repetition than you would from lifting. And he said the way that lifting might affect your running was actually from structural adaptations. And I've been thinking about this, right? And I kind of agree with him. I kind of don't, because I think as we've talked about on other episodes, there is a very strong neurological demand when you're lifting weights close to your 1 rep max. Like the higher the intensity of weightlifting, as in the higher percentage you are to your 1 rep max, the higher the neurological demand and the higher demand on your neurology to adapt to that specific demand. And that's the preference that you're going to use, especially when you're in a stressful situation. So neurologically, there could be some input when you're adapting to a high stress or an emergency situation, because you have this strong nervous system adaptation to external force, external load. If your body is adapted to or specialized in lifting mechanics, then you're neurologically going to prefer that pattern. That was something that I was like, okay, well, I get the repetition thing, but you would also have to make sure that if you're doing thousands and thousands of repetitions in the gait cycle, you would want to make sure that the gait cycle is actually correct and that you're actually reinforcing the good pattern within the gait cycle. The other thing was like, okay, so if you're creating structural imbalances from lifting a lot, and he used CrossFit runners as an example, it's like because CrossFitters are doing so much Olympic lifting and stuff, their run doesn't often look too good because they have really tight hips or they're stuck in external rotation, right? If that's the case and you're running thousands and thousands of repetitions in the gait cycle while you're running, and that's the practice that you're getting while you're having these negative structural adaptations from lifting, then that will neurologically negatively impact your gait cycle, wouldn't it? Like that's like just
Yeah.
from a common fucking sense perspective, dude. Like lifting will have some negative adaptations to your gait cycle the more that you specialize in it. Like the more you specialize your movement towards a linear plane movement, the less rotational movement and the less contralateral efficiency you're going to have. That seems like common sense to me.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying. And um, basically, it's like this: we have to define what type of lifting we're talking about, because he could be implying this to functional patterns, and that type of lifting is different than what Gota does and what WEC does, and it really and a whole bunch of other systems. They're really different. And lifting external objects versus manipulating your own body like an FRC would do. It's like we need to really actually, my goal here and what I was thinking was we have to unpack the questions that should be answered, not so much a debate here, but what are the actual answers that should be, or sorry, the questions that should be brought out here. Saying lifting is going to destroy your gait cycle. So let's take functional patterns. How do they lift? They have their para bars and they're moving them through space, right?
And you could argue that's not even lifting. That's like selecting force vectors for specific adaptations in resistance training. Like you're trying to link certain that you can't even call that like necessarily lifting, because you're not really lifting a weight per se. You're
Sure.
sort of moving it through different planes for a specific adaptation.
Well, my point to that was more, I'm just going to go through like WEC method does his coil, right? And he has, let's say, a
Yep.
kettlebell. And then you have Goda who don't say not to lift. I don't think they say that. They say don't lift up and down in a straight plane. Lift, move
They, you
weight
know what
forward.
they do? Yeah, they do say don't lift. They say don't lift weight, move weight, right? And so their perspective is less from, lifting to them means like think about the word lift. It's literally like picking something up, right? Moving something up and down through space. They're pretty against. I mean, they don't even do pull-ups at this point because it puts you too far in the front chain. Like you're leaning back into the front chain. Then when you're doing a pull-up, they don't even have their athletes doing pull-ups anymore. So they're like, don't lift weight, move weight, keep it completely 100% relative to forward locomotive stimuli because that's going to be what you're adapting to, right?
Yeah. So like that's kind of my point, is that every system looks at lifting differently. So this quote doesn't encompass everything, or it does encompass everything and it shouldn't. It should be like, what type of lifting has negative adaptations to the gait cycle, right?
Right.
And then no matter what, if we take this to an evolutionary argument, which I hate, there's so many of them and they're so theoretical, I like to stay away from it. So let's forget about that for a second and just say everybody you know is taking 10,000 steps a day, your office
Mhm.
worker,
Yep.
approximately, right? Some people double that. Um, this is no matter what, if you believe in evolution or you think it's this way or that way, it doesn't matter. People are doing this anyway. And this is the force that's going to be put through the body throughout the society. Okay. It's going to be put through bodies the most. So, is your lifting, and let's take powerlifting to start with, is
Mhm.
that going to have negative adaptations to your gait cycle? Let's take, and for the sake of making it more specific, let's take a barbell back squat. What
Yeah.
is happening during a normal barbell back squat that would have positive adaptations and negative adaptations? Let's take a little bit of a dive right now. Okay. So let's say I'm a power lifter and I put 225 on my back and
Mhm.
I'm squatting up and down with that weight. Let's pick attributes that would come about from that. Let's pick the adaptations that would come about from that.
Well, even,
So,
like from the powerlifting background, I'm thinking like, okay, well, my erectors are going to adapt to resisting a downward, like a vertical force downward, right? Like I'm getting spinal compression, and usually, you and I have talked a lot about the spinal engine being sort of a foundational piece of locomotive behavior. Like we don't really believe in the firm core bracing, stiff, rigid spine theory. And in order to resist the vertical force of like a barbell on your back, you have to maintain rigidity in your spine. You have to be very, very strong and braced, and your core has to be engaged because you're getting a compressive force on your spine to resist that. So that's the first thing that I think of. That's not even talking about like any of the actual movement from the hips and from the knees and from the ankles and stuff. Just from that first perspective, you're bracing like crazy and supporting a bar using both hands on your back. Like your spine has to stay rigid and your core has to stay engaged. And I don't see that happening in the locomotive cycle at all.
now we're getting into the gravy. This is exactly what should be the questions that should arise from this, right? So
Mhm.
is there a carryover at any point to, let's say, the spinal engine, or let's say head over foot, or the fact that your spine undulates laterally? I think everyone can agree it does it a little bit. Okay, the question is, how much does it do it? Okay, so lateral undulation of the spine, at what point does lifting a weight up and down and having to brace your core in the center as hard as you can, at what point does that ruin the neurology of the spine moving back and forth?
Mm.
I would say pretty fast, because your muscles and your fascia literally have to tighten up around your spine, and that's the antithesis to moving back and forth.
Hmm.
However, I'm going to offer a bridge here. The bridge is, you have to have enough and appropriate stiffness to be able to do your activities. Now, if somebody doesn't have that appropriate stiffness, could they get it through a core brace exercise? Possibly, right? So there's my bridge to the lifting world. It's like, oh, actually, we've been thinking this the whole time. It's actually appropriate stiffness. And we can marry that with the spinal locomotion, or the fact that it moves back and forth, because it's stiffening appropriately.
Hmm. So and that's this idea of, I guess too, we're assuming. spinal engine is correct as well, because some people actually do have the model that you need core rigidity and core stiffness, especially when you're in a high speed gait. Like when you're in a sprinting scenario, having a quote stable core or a rigid core is something that's going to help you with power generation. And I don't know if that's just because the theory is that you're resisting forces and you can get some recoil because your core is so strong, and so when you're whipping your arms you get the bounce out sort of thing. I don't know what the theory behind having a rigid core. Maybe it's a radiation for increased power output and like force production. Like the more you irradiate your core, the more force you can produce, because that's a lifting concept, right? Like the more you irradiate, the more strength you can express. But we're assuming that there is a lateral bend that happens within the gait cycle. And so, what is that level? Like the thing is, like if you specialize in lifting and if you specialize in the adaptations of the imposed demands of a barbell back squat, for example, you can develop the core stability and the core rigidity to resist that vertical force very, very well. The question is like, how much does that carry over to other movements where you're moving through space three-dimensionally, not just lifting something directly up and down with a bar directly on your back, right? Like
Yeah.
that, like what the specific adaptations to this particular imposed demand, how is it going to translate to something that actually happens in reality? Like even when you're lifting a weight in your life, like I think about because I used to be one of those guys that was like, oh, the deadlift is the ultimate expression of a functional movement because you're lifting this object off the ground. But I thought about it, it's like I'm using a double overhand position, so I have this double supinated position on a bar. But even when I lift a couch, I'm in a double supinated position, or I'm in a neutral. Like I've never been in a double pronated position when I'm lifting something in my life off the ground, whether it's like a piece of furniture or anything. Like even talking to Chris Chamberlain on our last episode, when he's talking about proximal core and using these sandbags to kind of emulate some of this like closing in proximal strength stuff, like that is like, okay, that kind of makes sense, because at least in reality, when you have to lift stuff, that's what is going to happen, right? But I've never in my life been in a situation where my hands are both pronated and I'm lifting something off the ground other than a barbell.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I'm with you on all this, right? And going back to the core theory there, it brings up an interesting point of first principles. Being honest with your first principles. My first principle is that there is an undulating spine, and that is a better way to do it in
Mm-hmm.
terms of efficiency moving forward. This undulating spine has to do with the counter rotations of your pelvis and the side to side undulation of your spine. And that rotates your ribs in a counter, rotates your shoulders and your hips in a counter rotation, basically, as you move forward. I think almost everybody agrees with that, but they never account for it in the models like within the linear world. Like I haven't heard them say anything about rotational movement at the pelvis and a counter rotation um, at the shoulders with the
Mm-hmm.
word spinal engine in it, because that's basically essentially what it is, right?
Yeah.
Like the fact that they're counter rotating and you're using, this is the key, you're using fascia to uh, harness the proper tensions of that dance between the pelvis and the shoulders. Okay. And that is done with the connective tissue between the spine and the pelvis, your thoracolumbar fascia.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, your hips move around like whips and your legs follow. Like, this is nowhere to be found in any model that I've seen, or nowhere to be accounted for. You try to account for that within the context of squatting. With a squat, your hips are dead stable.
Yeah.
Your hip, or in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion, are going to become like blocks. You're going to look very blocky as you move. This happened to me, and now I'm out
And
of
me.
this cycle. Yeah. So, and this is what I see in reality in front of me when I see lifters who try to run. They look like blocks. Okay. Maybe I'm not saying the reasoning. The reasoning could be they just don't run enough, or the reasoning being in the gym, they've made themselves, by putting compressive loads, that much stiffer in each part of their body, and it's now not dancing together.
So let's explore that hip concept for a little bit further, because you're talking about if there is this overhand rotation of the hips, and we've talked about this a ton in other episodes when we're talking about the gait cycle and locomotive behaviors. If the hips are meant to rotate and we're meant to kind of have that rotational element, let's look at what's actually happening when you're doing a barbell back squat. Most people want to maintain that neutral spine while you're back squatting, and like people talk about this like tail tuck that happens underneath, because when you reach a certain depth in a squat, if you don't have the room in your femurs for the proper rotation, you compensate by tucking your tailbone under, and you basically you flatten out your lumbar curve. And that's usually why people end up going a lot wider with their stance in the squat, and they'll push their knees out. They create a ton of external rotation because they're creating a lot of room in their hips so that their spine doesn't, go from this nice straight lumbar curve into a flattened lumbar. You don't get that tail tuck, right? So in order to do that, now you're also specializing this wide externally rotated position that your musculature is going to adapt to, right? You're going to be pushing your knee, and this is, I did the same thing to get myself deep. My knees were very, very seldom in a neutral position. I was always really, really far out. I had to get pretty wide, and I would allow some room externally for my hips to sink down without losing my spinal position. And that's going to create a specific adaptation too. We've talked about posture, where we want to kind of, Goda calls it standing in your columns, where your feet are stacked under your knees or stacked under your hips, and you stay in this back chain dominant position. Well, now you're hyper externally rotated. You're moving linearly up and down. You're lowering down in this super externally rotated position, and then you're coming up and you're shortening your glutes. And the issue is with your feet turned out like that too, you're shortening your gluteals like to the most that they could possibly be shortened. You're going to have a chronically tightened piriformis and a chronically tightened gluteus maximus, I think, because you're repeating this behavior over and over. So that structure is going to affect your gait mechanics at some point. Like that structural adaptation, even beyond, like, let's take the neurological adaptation away for a second. Like you are literally making your musculature adapt to this chronically shortened glute and this externally rotated position, which, you see a lot of these sprinters that will add squats and stuff into their strength mechanics, and they're running with these duck feet. It's like that's the way that they can get power out of their glutes, is because they're stuck in this external rotation.
I mean, yeah, that's one reason that would happen, right? Like, it's not always the fact that there's not room in the hips. There could be problems with the joint itself, right? Like,
Yeah.
I have that within my hip, within the low back. If someone has an issue and they can't hit a certain tilt, then there could be issues. Why even squat in the first place if that's where you're at, right? Like, you're adding massive compressive load. Even Fowler Fitness here says you're literally only adapting to the imposed demands, which is squatting. You're getting better at squatting. Okay. At some point, where's the carryover is my real question here, right? Let's talk about some of the positive adaptations, because this is where I think the linear force world has it correct, or has a very good grasp on what's happening. The linear forces, let's say I'm a sprinter. I can be a massive jack sprinter, or if I'm running a 40-yard, I can be a massive jacked linebacker if I have enough muscle and enough fast twitch to get me from point A to point B. But the factors involved there are the external variable. I want to get faster, and that's it. Okay. But if we add health into it, I don't think it is the same equation. Okay. I kind of lost my train of thought on that one, but do you have anything?
Yeah, well, you were talking about positive adaptations of the squat, right? And positive adaptations that could happen. And maybe a cool place to look would be comparing different types of squats. We could talk about the barbell squat. We could talk about how Goda looks at a squat. We could talk about how even Devin Brown from One of a Kind Fitness does a squat in a pretty unique way, and they all have different goals and different outcomes, right? Like I think for a barbell back squat, the positive adaptation that people talk about is like, well, you're producing more force in through your lower body, you're producing more drive, and with more neural drive, you can have better force output. That was always like my mentality. It's like, man, I'm literally stronger, so of course, when I'm propelling myself, forward in a locomotive way, I'm creating more force, and so I'll run faster. What other structural adaptations or neurological or just positive adaptations could you see coming out of a barbell back squat as it relates to gait?
Well, I mean, let's talk about gait in context of, because I see a lot of these guys talk about it in terms of running faster, sprint
Mhm.
mechanics, right? That it's sprint mechanics is sprinkled in with health. I don't think they're the same
Mm.
thing. Let's talk about sprint mechanics. So you are getting your CNS, your central nervous system, a workout. You're making it go at super highs, right?
Mhm.
So you do get some sort of neural adaptation there. You do get structural adaptations in terms of muscle stiffness. Your
Mhm.
muscles get more stiff. That could equal more elastic rebound if you have the appropriate stiffness. Okay. What else? I don't know. I haven't actually looked at the science of how squats translate into speed, because that's not really what I care about all that much. Not that last like 0.2 seconds on a 50 meter or 40 meter run, but I can see there being linear force transfer between a heavy squat and having to run 40 yards or 100
Mm.
yards,
Mhm.
right? Like, I don't deny that. There's probably some carryover there. Although for other sports, let me say, like for boxing, if I have to put my foot down, I'm putting it down and I'm letting it go real fast for the most part, unless you're a power puncher who can back someone into a corner and have themselves rooted. I
Mm.
want to push my foot into the ground fast and have that push into the ground be like 0.1 second and be able to outlet power in that amount of time. You could see that with Gervonta Davis when he knocked out Rolly Romero this weekend. It was a fast, quick lightning punch, and he was able to force transfer very, very fast.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in a squat, you have to push your feet down into the ground for like seconds at a time to generate the muscular effort it takes to go up and down in a squat. This is different from pulsing in even a walk where you're touching down, muscles are going to fire and then shut off, fire and then shut off, fire and then shut off. That doesn't happen in a sustained lift. Okay. And again, I wanted to get super specific with what I'm talking about, because there is explosive lifts that you may work with this variable. However, I'm talking about sustained squats right now. That would be a sustained force into the ground versus a fast reaction that you need in
Yeah.
more sports.
And you know, like it kind of depends on the repetition style when we're talking about this, because you know, I think about how Christian Thibodeau cues a lot of his squats with his athletes, which is you do a 3 second eccentric, and then almost like you like in the last quarter of the squat, you bounce in and out of it, right? You have that rebounding effect, and he won't do that all the time because you know his mentality is, you know, the slower eccentrics, you want to have phases in your periodization where you're emphasizing eccentrics so that you can have tendinal adaptations, so that you can have more structural support to get some of that rebounding elastic recoil stuff.
Yeah.
So he'll take periods where he's training tendon thickness specifically as the sort of full goal focus of a periodization block. But then a lot of the time it's that you're taking advantage of that stretch reflex and bounding out of it. And you know, and he'll pair that with things like depth drop jumps where you're jumping off and jumping up, because the amount of force that you have when you're jumping is even greater of a level of force than when you're using a barbell, because you know that's what happened. Like one of the arguments that you made against tissue training in one of our very early episodes was like, yeah, you can train all these awkward positions, but you can't do it in actual movement. You can't do it dynamically. You have to be able to train these positions statically, because that's the only way that you can load them progressively over time. But the issue is, even if you're loading these things progressively over time, when you're in a dynamic scenario, the level of force that you produce, like if you're jumping and you're landing on one foot, like you're not going to, like, it's exponentially higher than if you're just like doing a static loaded position.
Wait, can we talk about that? Because um, you ever watch the stories? I love these stories when I put it up. It's like bikers who land perfectly on a downslope and just make the impossible look easy, right?
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
really what it's about. When you catch the energy properly, that's what it's about. That's why you can take 7 times your force, because it's
Mm.
not a linear push down. It's not a piston. And they're like, I don't get it. Why can it be 7 times more in a run than a squat? We can't even simulate a run with this squat, because you've heard this over and over, right? Like, I can't simulate the forces of a run with a squat because it's 7 times more. But they're not taking into account that it's like you're catching the energy in that
Yeah.
way, right? That's nowhere to be found in any models, and also not accounted for in a squat. And where your heels down, let's talk about that. Heels down training, okay? The fact that driving through your heels never happens or shouldn't happen in a sprint or a run, or you shouldn't be heavy in it in a walk anyway. So that's another thing we can talk about, right?
So this is an interesting concept, right? Because the vertical ground force might be 7 times more than what you would experience in a squat, but you're not absorbing that force, right? You're talking about, it's like we're not meant to be a piston. This is the whole GOTA idea of what the actual, when they talk about bowing and cornering, they create this bow position in the lower body for this sort of transference, not absorb, like they call it, you'll absorb force into a bow, but if you actually look at how the force is distributed all the way up the bow in through the whole, like it goes through the whole system and transfers out with their cornering of the energy. So GOTA isn't this thing where it's like, they're basically saying it's like the more that you neurologically adapt to treating your body like a piston system where you are absorbing force, the more wear and tear you're going to incur on your system. Versus if you neurologically pattern the proper dynamics of transference of energy through the body in the way that the body is designed to transfer energy efficiently in, out, and through, then you're going to have less issues with your system, breaking down, right? And that's what you're talking. I think you think of like the bikers that you're posting in your stories that are like doing these massive jumps and then just like easily landing them and taking the next turn. I think of because I used to do parkour. I would jump off of these like 20-foot roofs at I was like 17 or something, 17, 18. I would jump off these 20-foot roofs, but I couldn't land in a squat. I couldn't absorb the force into a squat. I've seen people do that before. But I would land and then I would keep the momentum forward and I would roll the energy out so that my body wasn't absorbing the force like a piston. And I wasn't absorbing and then bouncing it back out. I'm not a hydraulic press, like I'm like I was transferring the energy out of my body. And I think that's a really interesting sort of take. So when this guy Grant Fowler is talking about like lifting is going to destroy your gait cycle, it's just that you're training the pattern of this piston absorption or this force absorption through the body or force production through the body, and not prioritizing the elastic qualities of your fascia. You're not practicing the transference of energy through your body. You're trying to take it and produce the force yourself. It is a different mechanical and neurological input. It is a different self-organizational strategy, but the more that you optimize for that self-organizational strategy, the more the other self-organizational strategy, I think, is going to suffer.
Yeah, no, that's my opinion on it as well. I don't think he's correct here. I think that he's actually looking at it backwards, where basically we're just taking it now into a different question. We're like, what are the adaptations? You can argue with me over the adaptations. You can be like, that's not correct. There is no spinal engine. Sure, if that's your opinion, that's fine, because my first principle is that there is an undulating spine and there is gearing towards your spine. So spine behaves differently when it's in front chain, meaning your hips are way in front. And I know that's a generalization of front chain. Hips way in front of your ribs, you're going to behave differently. You're going to have different tensions, different tensegrity than if your hips are way back and you have a long decompressed spine, a nice pelvic tilt that rotates in an overhead motion. Here's the thing. Does anybody out there, I would love to hear it, deny that there's an overhead motion of the pelvis as you walk forward? Is there any other variation to that should be the case, right? Having opposite rotations of your pelvis and your shoulder, okay? If you admit this, and everybody does, and you think it's a straight plane, then they're just straight rinsing out back and forth. They're actually undulating back and forth in a figure 8, okay? Like if I made my xiphoid process into a marker and I wanted to be smooth as I walk, I would go with that figure 8. I'm letting you in on a little bit of a movement secret here, okay? I'd move in a figure 8. As I'm traveling with that figure 8, my momentum's going that way, okay? Let's say I'm on the upslope of a sideways 8, an infinity symbol. I can harness that momentum. I don't want to change my momentum and use my footwork to change directions, okay? That's an example of how to use the counter rotations of your spine and pelvis with the theoretical overhead motion. Okay. That's how I use it in reality. It works with martial arts. I showed a high-level martial artist. He got this right away. So in application, it works. It only works in theory to keep your spine neutral. You never brace your core. And that's another thing, bracing your core out against an object like a lifting belt. When does that ever happen? Ever in reality? And you're going to train for that. You're training your nervous system to do that. Okay.
Well, and I did, right? Like, I'm like, you and I are both examples of like, we had that adaptation show up in all of our other movements. Like, you watch us, you watch us doing ropes, like the RMT rope when we first started, and we're stiff and rigid. And like, my core was braced when I started doing roping, and I was like moving my arms around a little bit, but I looked like a robot because I was in core bracing mode. It does show up in other movements. To say it doesn't show up in other movements is kind of ridiculous to me.
I want to see these great movers that only do the heavy lifting and look smooth as they move. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it exists. Maybe it does. I don't know. I don't really see. I'm talking smooth movement, like somebody who looks like they're very smooth as they move. Let's talk a Michael Jordan. Let's talk somebody in sports who moves really well. They're not going to be lifters. They're going to be athletes who maybe have lifted, but they're not going to be straight from the lifting world.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's funny because like the example that some people will jump to using is this guy Juji Mufu, who's this, he was an acro guy before he was a bodybuilder, a power lifter, right?
Before he was, and
exactly. that's the big thing, right? Like, before he got into heavy powerlifting and stuff, he was a skinny acro dude. And so his ability to like bound and leap, and it's funny because the more that he specialized in bodybuilding and powerlifting, the less you're seeing him do these complex soft acrobatic stuff. And at the end of the day, it's because he's specializing in a specific adaptation. I think in terms of like, are there smooth movers who come from a lifting background? Like, I don't think there is either. I remember Chris Summers, who was the founder of the Gymnastics Bodies program. He talked about getting a group of bodybuilders in for a sample class, and he gets them on the gymnastics mat. He does this warm up where all he's getting his athletes to do is just stand and bound, and they're just doing like little bounces on their calves. And none of these guys could do it. Like, they were dying by the end of the first minute of doing this. So like, these big muscular bodybuilders, they all failed to warm up. Like, what the hell is going on here? These guys can't move for shit. Like, and so there was this idea that the specialization in hypertrophy and strength screwed up their ability to move and bound in a way that like, like a 12-year-old girl could do very, very easily,
So if you're really good at producing force, you're going to want to produce force everywhere. Like, when I used to lift, and I could lift 450, like, on most occasions, just go up to 450, lift it, right? And I'm less than 170 pounds usually. When I go skiing, what did I want to do? I wanted to charge through things. I wanted to turn really fast and get those G forces.
Yeah.
Now I'm like spinning off things. I'm jumping off things. I'm like able to turn way faster. It's a different game because my body is responding differently. Okay. I'm putting out the nervous system that I have done. And there's your SAID principle. This is what I think he actually means by this SAID principle. I put something in like heavy lifting, and my external variable, my imposed demands, I was able to do it. So for example, your imposed demands on a squat are you squatting up and down. You're going to get specifically good at that motion. For me, skiing is a halfway squat. So I treated it like I'm in an isometric and a halfway squat. And because I could lift 450, I could plow through things that, one, destroyed my body because I'm just plowing through everything. Now I'm trying to absorb, right? Both worked. And if I just videotape myself, I would have looked great, right? But that doesn't show me what I adapted to internally. It just shows me the external adaptation. So there is a difference between internal adaptations through your nervous system, through your lymph system, through your muscular system, through your fascial system, through all these different types of systems versus your external variable. Another easy example would be jumping on a high box. Let's say I jump on a 50-inch box. my specific adaptation to my imposed demand is that I adapted to jumping 50 inches or whatever it is. Okay.
Mhm.
But the internal adaptation was my fascia getting more elastic, my rate of force development getting higher. And even that isn't right. My cells, my tissues, actually, we should talk about that rate of force development, because that's a big
Yeah.
one.
So,
Is
because
that actually
you know,
internal or external?
well, I think the rate of force development is the symptom of internal adaptations,
Yeah.
right? And because you could say it's the speed of communication in motor units. You could say it's the efficiency of and like how many um like it's a symptom of internal adaptations. Like I think it is. It's like it's you could almost say
I
it's a
think you've said it.
byproduct.
I
Yeah.
think the first thing you said was speed of efficiency of your nervous system,
Mm.
getting to like be able to harness your musculature, or the uh, tendinous play that the muscle has. Let's say it's Achilles, where you're
Mm.
using the Achilles elasticity to bound yourself up, and you time that with a muscular pulse.
Yeah.
There's your proper rate of force development. Okay, so it is an external variable coming from an internal set of adaptations.
So I want to follow up on the next point that he had. So he's like lifting engine or gait engine. Why don't we have both, right? And so he's saying that because you have a different goal and different mechanical and neurological input, you're gonna have a different outcome. So in his mind, maybe you can be training the gait and lifting as two separate, self-organizational principles, and they don't have to um, have negative adaptations towards each other. But the issue is, like, as Ido
But they
Portal has
do.
said, the more, well, this is exactly it. The more that you specialize in one thing, the bigger of the price that you pay in terms of your ability to move in other ways, right? And so if you're optimizing for gait mechanics, you're not going to lift as much. If you optimize for lifting mechanics, you're not going to run as well. Like that's common sense to me. And my question is, how, like, what is there a sweet spot where you can have really good gait mechanics and really good elastic quality and the ability to do these leaping, bounding, running, striding movements and have good fluid movement while also still being able to lift a ton of weight? And that's why I was really stoked to talk to Chris Chamberlain, because he seems to be on that path himself. I wanted to share. It was interesting because I remembered I saw this old picture that was it was the hypothetical workout routine of Batman. And I know this is like really funny, but I'm gonna share this
Let's see it.
screen here. Um, we'll talk about this is Batman's routine as made by someone who doesn't know anything about exercise physiology. On Sunday, he does in the morning a 30-minute jog, 30-minute meditation, evening clean and jerk lifts, 3 reps for 8 sets at 262 pounds, 5 sets of metabolic condition with a quarter-mile run, 21 kettlebell swings, 12 pull-ups, 30 minutes of flexibility, 30 minutes of sparring. Monday morning, 30-minute jog, 30 minutes of a traditional kata with a focus on Japanese forms. In the evening, 5 sets of 20-foot rope climbs, 30 minutes on the gymnastics ring, working on muscle ups in particular, high box jumps, 12 reps with 8 sets, crunches, 50 reps for 5 sets, 30 minutes of heavy bag hitting, 30 minutes of flexibility, 30 minutes of target practice. Tuesday,
Gotcha.
30-minute jog in the morning, 30 minutes of yoga, evening, half a mile swim. And then he's doing 5 reps for 7 sets at a 620-pound deadlift. Lighter deadlifts, doing 30 straight reps at 310. Nice little cool down deadlift set. And then 30 minutes of sparring.
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday is his off day. And on his off day, he does a 20-mile run. And in the running at a 450 mile, by the way. And evening is skills training only, 30 minutes of target practice, 30 minutes of flexibility, 30 minutes of upper body basics, 30 minutes of lower body basics, 30 minutes observation, 30 minutes meditation, 30 minutes holds and pressure points. Thursday morning, 30-minute jog, 30 minutes of traditional kata, focus on Okinawan forms. And in the evening, he's doing 5 reps for 10 sets of squats at 525 pounds, 1 hour of bouldering, 30 minutes of flexibility, 50 reps for 5 sets of abdominal crunches, 30 minutes of target practice, and 30 minutes of heavy bag.
So
On
what
Friday morning, what's that?
what is the purpose of going through this?
This is this is like an obviously impossible routine that no one could
Oh,
ever do, even with the like, but this is Batman's, like, this is canon. This is like canonically what Batman was done. And this was sent to a guy that I followed named John Roman Yellow, who was like, hey, can you look at this and can you pick this apart and tell me what you would change and tell me. And he said, look, at the end of the day, first of all, Batman is just working out too much, and he wouldn't have any time to fight crime. Even if he could adapt to this, this is like way too much training, and he's spending like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours training and not spending any time fighting crime. His body would be wrecked, and he wouldn't be able to actually get into any fights. And the other thing is there are too many adaptations happening at once, and the trainer who was criticizing it, he said, like, it's one thing to be strong and fast. It's another thing to be fast and have good endurance. It's another thing to be, strong and have good endurance. But to have all of these things at once, like, the adaptations will happen very, very slowly, and you won't maximize any of them. So the point in me sharing this was this idea that like, the biggest criticism that anyone could have of this program, because it's so obvious, is that you would not adapt to all of these things maximally. Like, this is a maximum, like, you could take any one of these things, like the jogs or the swims or the deadlifts or any of that, like, those would be standalone focuses of stimuli that the body would have a hard time adapting to. And the more you adapt to them, the better you get at them. But you can't do all of this stuff and adapt to it. Maybe with the assistance of a ton of pharmaceuticals and like perfect life conditions where all your recovery factors are taken into account, but no one could ever in a gazillion years be able to sustain this level of training, right? And so the point of me sharing this was this idea that like, you have specific adaptations to impose demands, period. And the more that you specialize in one, the more you're sacrificing the other, right? And so, like, if you were training Batman, like, I'd be getting rid of all the deadlifts and shit. I'd be getting rid of a lot of the like, I'd get him running and doing a lot of martial arts focused stuff because he has to fight crime. And that's like, if you think about what are Batman's specific imposed demands of being Batman, well,
exactly.
he has to climb, he has to fight, and he has to run, and he has to be able to take a hit, right? So I'd be getting him in martial arts specific training where his work capacity for grappling and fighting and striking were really, really high. And I'd get him climbing so that if he had to, like, and I'd get him doing like free running stuff. And that specific demand would make it so that he could adapt to be better at being Batman.
Well, I'm almost on the flip side of that. Like, I get what you're saying compared to what he's doing now, but everything I'm seeing that what he's doing besides the meditation, and even that is kind of an external thing. It's all external variables. He's trying to do an external feat, but it has nothing to do with like what he needs in his body. So if I had Batman and I had him, I was like, what do you actually need? And what is the physiological way for you to get there the fastest? Okay. So like, I would go with his actual demands, and I would engineer exercises or movements that he needs. If he needs specific tissue in a certain part, I would do it like that. Okay. But I would always bring it back to making his attributes of running better. Okay. So his hips being able to move smoothly in an overhead fashion without dumping laterally, which I see from like so many people. Okay. And I guarantee you bodybuilders are displaying this everywhere, right? Over rigidity and great in one plane of motion when you're still. And that's pretty much it. Okay. So agility is going to be a big one there. And again, what internal variables do you need to make you agile? If your ribs are stuck, if Batman's ribs are stuck, then I have to get him unstuck. What is the best way to do that? I mean, there's a million different ways to go about that. It depends on his issue. If he, let's say, broke a rib 6 months earlier and never got that worked out, and his body is tightening up the muscles around there, I would have to work the rib and, make the muscle a little bit less scared in that area, and then he can integrate things. That would be, just a small example. Or let's say he has a hip issue, a labral tear, on his right hip, and he has a trouble internally rotating his hip. So he has to work around that. We have to figure that out. And then we have to devise a way for him to move his hip as he moves through space. Again, with squatting, it's just like pump up and down, pump up and down. None of this is accounted for, right? So again, the first principles come into play here. If you believe that the body is a straight line piston that goes straight linearly forward, then that's how you're going to train. And that's the pinnacle of training. And I guarantee you, you're going to be displaying linear force mechanics in your movements. Okay. The one move explosive guy is everywhere. And it's really hard to deal with that because it's so sexy. You know what I mean? Like being able to do one move explosively and stand there like a statue afterwards. You know, those guys, they're everywhere. Okay. Like that is a display of linear force to me, but that's not movement efficiency or smoothness in display. That is a 5-second algorithm. You know, you're feeding the algorithm because you can move fast and impressive in a 5-second stint. But again, we have to look internally. What does the person actually need? Does he need to jump on a 50-inch box from like a side angle? Or does he need to get his hip to be not inflamed anymore? Because you know what I mean? It's like which one precedes the other one. So I don't see the squat model accounting for any of this stuff. I don't see the heavy lifters accounting for, I see them injured all the time. And I don't see good movement out of that camp. So that type of lifting, I would really, really caution against if you want to be a smooth mover. Now, if I'm wrong, if you have found the formula to integrate really heavy lifting with really good movement, let me know.
Right. You know, one of the things that kind of came up for me while you were describing all of that is that if we have these rotational patterns and like let's say, you know, use the example of Batman injuring his rib, and so a bunch of stuff is getting really, really tight. Now all of a sudden he's developing compensatory patterns. If you don't train the ability to deal with lateral forces and you don't train the ability to rotate, and your body doesn't rotate and it's trying to deal with rotational forces, you're going to exacerbate compensatory patterns within the gait cycle. Like your body will start to develop compensatory patterns. Like if you're stuck in external rotation in your hips and you can't access internal rotation, which by the way, when I started working on my gait mechanics from squatting as much as I did, my inability to internally rotate when I ran inhibited my ability to run smooth and to run longer and to run efficiently. So being able to structurally adapt to a place where I had more access to internal rotation dynamically, you know, like, you know, not just like getting on the floor and doing internal rotation stuff a la 90-90, you know, driving my knee into the ground and my ankle into the ground, trying to get this, you know, again, static internal rotation. I'm trying to get it to a point where, as it relates to gait, can I access more hip internal rotation so that I have better mechanics, so I'm showing less compensatory patterns? Can I actually get thoracic rotation independent of, you know, basically relying on lateral bending as well in order to do it? Like, can I get true freedom of movement so that when I'm going through these movements, I'm not creating compensatory patterns to deal with these external forces? How you deal with external forces is going to show up in the way that you deal with external forces. So if you're training yourself to deal with external forces with a barbell, then your body knows how to deal with those external forces that way. It's going to show up whenever there's an external force, I think.
It's interesting. Specific adaptations to imposed demand. Your imposed demand was to lift heavy off the, you know, bilaterally squat. Let's just say the squat again, right? Your demand was to lift the squat. You will get better at squatting. But again, like in your reality, when you were actually squatting a lot and lifting heavy weights and doing, you know, I did programming from Juggernaut. I've done programming from Westside Barbell. I've done all that, right? When I was doing it, I needed to do Kelly Starrett band work because that was the way I knew how to do it at the time, to be able to free up space within my joints to be able to actually even squat. And I'm not alone on this. I see this everywhere. There's a reason Kelly Starrett exists, right? It's because people are, you know, you would think that going down and heavy into a squat at depth would give you the ability to do it again like 5 days later, but it really doesn't carry over all that much, right? Like it does have some carryover, and HEG has proved that, but people are getting stuck. And that's where, you know, the band work comes into play. That's where a lot of this prehab comes into play. That's where a lot of this 90-90, oh, you're too tight, just go to yoga and yoga will solve it. And like this stuff happens. I deal with it every single day. I'm too tight, I need to stretch out. That's the thought process most people have, right? But it's like, why are you even doing this in the first place? No matter what, squatting is not the priority. Squatting with weight is not the priority of the human, whether you believe in evolution, whether you believe in something else. You are walking most of the day. Most of the population is walking most of the day. This is a different discussion. If you're having it for the regular population, then you're having it for somebody who wants to squat because they enjoy it, or an athlete who wants to get their, whatever they do better, right? Like, those are different discussions to be had. And I feel like the discussions kind of merge into each other and like, oh, it's healthy too, plus this, right? And I think this conversation is really important to be able to parse out what the actual questions are. Is your heels down training making you go heels down in the game? Is your tissue adapting? Like, let's say your muscle, the way it fires, is it adapting same in the gym under a squat load as it would be in a run? Highly doubt it, right? At some point, again, you're adapting to squatting. You're adapting to squatting an external load. As far as I'm concerned, and this is my first principle, I don't have proof for this, that humans were designed to squat, to chill, to rest, okay? And not to repetitively lift a heavy load over and over and over again. Even if you had to carry a weight, you would probably do it walking, okay? So I don't see that being an adaptation that ever was something until the barbell was invented less than 100 years ago. Like, the barbell was invented less than 100 years ago. This is not a normal thing to do. This is a cultural thing to do. It's common sense. It's cultural. And then we try to fit what we need from it. It's like, we need to actually be more intelligent and have a better way to do things so we don't mess up everyone's hips. You know what I mean? Like, and that is my assertion. That is happening with heavy weightlifting, a la powerlifting style. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that a little bit of it will completely destroy you. I don't know that. I don't know where the proper dose would be. I suspect it's very, very, very little. However, if you do it a lot and you adapt to it, you're going to be in trouble.
And I also think, like this idea of like the reason that you and I kind of got into these discussions is I think we both got to a point where it's like, I don't want to feel like I have to do body work on myself just to maintain the way that I'm training. Like, I want my training to be what makes me feel good, not have to do a bunch of other stuff to make me feel good to counter all the effects of making myself feel bad from the way that I train. And I was talking to Devin of One of a Kind Fitness recently, and we were talking about this phenomenon of like, you're squatting all the time. So you're forcing your hips into this external rotation with these shortened glutes. Then you get into this band, you have the band, you're doing some of the ready state stuff. You're doing some Kelly Starrett stuff, and you're opening up that glute and you're opening up that space in the hip because you're constantly closing it off again. You're always in this like yin yang thing of trying to get back to this homeostatic state where your body doesn't feel like shit anymore. It's like, you shouldn't, like, for me, your training, your movement practice should make you feel better in your body. It should make you move better. It shouldn't have to have, you shouldn't have to take your body to the garage for tune-ups before and after your training, because that's what your training should be, in my opinion, right? That's the ultimate idea here. So if you're training it like, and again, like, this is context dependent. If you want to be a CrossFit athlete, if you want to lift because you enjoy it, if you're a bodybuilder and you're training for aesthetics, you still have to make sure that your joints are staying healthy. You still have to make sure that you're dealing with these negative adaptations to structural and biomechanical efficiency within your body, which it's just a reality if you're lifting.
Like, the fact that people deny that compressive load with hundreds and hundreds of pounds repetitively is going to compress your spine, it's just common sense, really, right? Like, your spine is going to be compressed. Let's say you're an athlete, you're compressing your spine, you're working hard. I would devote that time more to recovery and very specific adaptations that are needed versus just heavy inputs. Now, again, I'm kind of open to debate on that, because maybe there is a sweet spot with, maybe not heavy lifting, but having your nervous system heightened for a short period of time. Okay. And how to integrate that into an actual functional movement. Okay. That's what I want to kind of get to. maybe we should talk about how to solve this problem, right?
Right.
Like, what
Well,
is
let's
the actual way to squat? Like, how would I change the squat in order to not have these negative adaptations that, again, they're my claims, right? Like, or our claims that these are negative adaptations that are happening, the ones that we mentioned. So how do we go around that?
so let's
I'll propose something off the get-go.
sure.
It's the fact that, one, you come into whatever you're coming into as a regular person. I'm talking that level now. You have compensations that you've built up throughout your lifetime, right? Like, you may have arthritis in your hip if you're a little bit older. You may have not done a true anterior pelvic tilt in years, right? So, I mean, even getting somebody to understand their body, a la like FRC style, where they move each individual joint just to get an orientation of where it is in space, so that in the future, when I'm cueing, I can be super exact. Okay. That's where I would start with it. And it's not going to be externally loaded off the get-go, especially with a regular person. It's going to be, can you move this part? And when you try to move it, is there pain? Can you actually even accomplish the task of, let's say, understanding where your pelvis is in space? If you can't, you're going to have a big issue. That's what we need to do, because that's the center point of where your body is moving energy around, the spine and the hips. And again, during the squat, they're dead silent. They're straight, right? How is the straight behavior going to turn into a rotary behavior automatically? Like, where is this?
it's that is the question, right? And I think the point of the squat isn't to develop the rotary behavior. I wanted to talk about how different functional systems approach the squat in a different way. Like, for example, I know Goda will do a squat where they do something called an access squat, which is you're bowing and then cornering a little bit, right? Like, so you set a wider bow the deeper you go into the squat. And then as you come up, if you extend all the way, first of all, you're not thrusting your hips forward. So you're staying back chain dominant, and you're training the behavior of bowing and cornering in the femur. So the adaptation that you're having, the demand, is creating a bow and creating a corner, and you're teaching this action. So the behavioral adaptations are the movement in the femur that they would want to see in motion. It's just happening bilaterally as opposed to unilaterally or contralaterally within the gait cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe we should go for the audience, maybe go over bowing and cornering one more time.
Yeah, so bowing, and I'll just show, like, I'll demonstrate a squat here if I can. I'm in my little purple short shorts here. We're talking about, I'll move my mic here 1 second. It might be hard to hear me right now. And again, if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, we have all the replays up on YouTube now and on nofilter.net, right? So in a Goda stance, I would start in my columns. I would get my inside ankle bones high, and then I would go really far back chain to initiate the squat. So my hips move really far behind. I almost think in terms of like a deadlift almost. And then what I think about when I'm going to the access squat is I just move my hips straight down and my legs pressurize outwards, and I come into a deep bow. And I don't even have to go super far down. I'm not even moving my hips forward, like there's no forward and back action. Like, I'm just thinking my hips move up and down almost like an elevator after I'm in that back chain position, right? As I come up, my femurs internally rotate, but my hips are still back, right? So I come down, I bow, my knees, there's an outward pressure, my inside ankle bones are high. I come up, you almost see my kneecaps rotating in as I come up. There's a double corner action. So double bow, double corner, my hips are staying back in my back chain the whole time. And that would be a Goda squat.
Can you give a side view?
Yeah. So I got my hips back here in my columns. And you'll see my hips almost stay in the exact same place in terms of, like, I'm not moving forward or back here. This is called an access squat.
Okay.
And yeah, that's a standard Goda movement to sort of assess a double bowing and cornering movement, and you can get more depth, and it's one of their tells for squat mechanics.
Yeah, like I like that, and the bowing and cornering is really the best parsing out I've seen of the idea. of how to look at it's so simple, and it's so denied right now by the industry that it even exists. Like, I'm not saying that there's not room for debate on how to train it, but are we actually seeing it in motion? Like, Gota has put up probably like 500 videos of this action happening, and you have to see it from the front to back. It literally is like, just show the rotary motions back and forth. It really just is like literally taking a turn. Your shoulders, hips, ankles take a turn at the same time. Like, Anthony's really exaggerating it there, right? But if you were to jog, they are doing that motion, but really, really subtly, right?
Yeah.
So your hip is back on landing. It's behind your ribs, okay? Your ankles opened up, so it's high, and your shoulders back, and they all come around a theoretical corner at the same time, or very, very closely, okay? And you can argue over like milliseconds there, what's happening, what's leading the charge. I think it depends on the person and where they're tight and how they release energy, but it's an energy wave, okay? It's moving from, like, you can see this on runners. We don't need to even show this so much here. If you go on any of the Gota pages, you can see them over and over and over again. I always post it as well. If you're denying that there's a cornering action as Gota defined it, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear somebody go, there's no cornering. It doesn't happen. Now, again, is it the best way to train? That's a different story than is it happening? Okay.
Right. So I wanted to talk about a different approach, or a different angle in terms of a squat anyway, is like when I talked to Devin from One of a Kind, he was talking about how the cornering and even the bowing that happens, it's less of an active femoral rotation that you're doing yourself, and it's more a result of having a stable lumbopelvic hip complex, and that when you're landing and you get this force, the bow will automatically happen. And because you're stable and you want to return to that neutral position, when you release the energy, it just comes out, if that makes sense. Are you kind of following what I'm saying?
It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense.
Like a bow and a corner will happen naturally as the result of having the stability to resist vertical and lateral forces and rotational forces, etc. Right? So in a run, you would still land, but you would still have the experience of a bow happening, but it would be from a stable lumbopelvic hip complex absorbing that energy properly and then releasing it, because you have the proper attributes for your tissues to actually transfer that energy. So from his perspective, you want to have enough stability in the lumbopelvic hip complex to resist those lateral forces. The way he would do a squat is he would go a little bit wider, and he would have the knees facing forward. And as you come down, you're resisting external rotation. Because when we think of a powerlifting squat, how I would used to get into a squat, Ido Portal style, I just put my feet out, I would come down into a squat, and I can hang out there. That's like a powerlifting Ido Portal squat. See how externally rotated I am? I look like Zoidberg from Futurama, basically, right?
Yeah.
Versus he will come to a 90 degree, maybe even use some support so that the knees are still facing forward. And the big thing here is that I have integrity. I'm not losing my lumbar curve at all, right? So usually what happens is when you come down, while you're in a slightly neutral or internally rotated position at the hips, you would start to compensate by rounding your lumbar curve. So he'll come to 90 degrees to maintain the integrity of the lumbar curve. And again, this is stabilizing the lumbopelvic hip complex while resisting the desire to externally rotate to create compensations in the hip. Does that make sense? So that's where he's looking at the resistance of lateral forces to create stability in the hip, to develop the attributes where you can absorb the force, the lateral force, where you can create a good bow and a release, but you're creating a tissue adaptation to sort of resist these forces that happen in motion. So you're not training the motion exactly, but you're training the ability or the sort of vector of force that would happen in motion.
Gotcha. I mean, yeah, like we should get him back on to explain that a little bit further in terms of like his language, right? Like I understand what you're saying.
I probably butchered it, by the way.
Don't probably better to ask him, right?
Yeah. I butchered that. I talked to him quite at length,
No, like,
and I, but yeah,
sorry, what
that
you're saying makes sense to me. It does. But the only thing is actually what you said, people being able to just find the bow.
mm,
It's like, I don't know about that. I don't know that if somebody has the attributes of a spine that is stable, that they'll just find a bow and a good bow. Like, I
well,
don't know that that's the case because I haven't seen it. You know, like
yeah,
I
well,
haven't seen
for him,
the.
he's saying, like, I think his argument is that the bow is just not something that you automatically, that you would consciously do. He's saying that it's a result of what's happening in motion as a result of lateral and vertical forces. That the body does that to manage the transfer of energy, but it's not something that a person will consciously do. And if you show, like, if you practice the bow, you're not actually creating the structure of what's actually absorbing the forces properly. The bow is a byproduct of your body's ability to handle forces in motion. That's his take, right? And the point of this also was just to talk about how different systems would use a squat to create locomotive relevant adaptations, right? Like how can you make a bilateral squat relevant to something that is contralateral in human movement? Like it's kind of a tough scene, right?
And again, like what you're showing there, um, I like that idea of getting your pelvis to spread out. And this is almost to me a PRI type of idea.
Mm,
That's where I've heard it, is really like when you're internally rotated, your pelvis is kind of moving in a lateral way. It's almost opening up like a book if you look at it
hmm. Yep.
from the back, right? Like it's opening up, and when you're externally rotating, it's coming back in. Okay, and this is like your actual SI joint, your sacroiliac joint doesn't move that much, but you have a lot of
Mhm.
soft tissue there, and it pulls in either direction. So if I have both my femurs internally rotated, it'll pull the external rotators, like the what you would consider the rotator cuff muscles of the shoulder. You have them in the hips too. It pulls them from external to internal. So
Mm.
that to me is very good because most people are stuck in the external state.
Yeah.
And when people in the past have cued squats, they go, spread the floor out with your feet, or another one would have been push your knees out. I heard Kelly Starrett
Hmm.
used to say it all the time. Some
Yeah.
people are saying he didn't say it, but that's what I interpreted it as.
And that was a cue that I used as well, by the way. Spread your feet apart and push your knees out. Like that was to create more space in your hips so that you don't round your lumbar.
Yeah. And
And
well,
that's also why when we're talking about needing all that banded stuff, like that squat is that banded exercise to create that space in your hips, right? Like that's the whole point of it, is to create that space in your hips the way that the banded distraction would.
yeah. So it's interesting because the hips, a lot of the what's stuck is usually the ligaments surrounding the hips. It has
Mm,
a big ligament system, and that's really what's holding over a long period of time. That's what's holding you tense in
mhm,
there, right? That's why labral tears, with the labrum is basically a suction cup that sits in there. Um, it's one of your security systems. The second one would be the ligaments on the outside, the huge ligaments, iliofemoral, and the third one would be the muscles, right? And the actual like fascia and the muscle wrapping around that glute and the external rotators underneath. And that's what most people, they can literally get a change very fast, is because they're so stuck in the external, most people, especially lifters, that if they opened it up PRI style, or going internally rotated with their femurs and taking the pelvis along with it, they're going to get a
mm,
lot out of that. Even if they do like a, what's it called? Like almost like a deadlift motion where you're hinging at the hip, then once you feel the tension there, a small drop into the squat, and
mm,
then bounce out of that and feel those hips moving back. And that to me is what I would use, let's say in boxing, when I drop into one slot to get power out of my glute. That's exactly what it looks like. That's exactly the tension I want.
mhm,
Versus, in a squat where I'm down at the bottom, bouncing out of the bottom, that's going to be a different style. Maybe even a
mhm.
kettlebell where you're using your elasticity in a backwards way, like when the kettlebell swings down and you have to bounce it out. I see that as more of an elastic recoil that would have transfer, at least tissue wise, to a movement. Now, if you can modify it where you're not hip thrusting, because that doesn't happen in sport, okay, unless you're jumping, or
Mhm.
hip thrusting happens in wrestling and all those sports. but a lot of locomotion sports, you're not actually hip thrusting.
Mhm.
Okay. So maybe modifying the kettlebell to be able to bounce out of that hole halfway, a quarter squat, but not hip thrusting. Okay. My other point to that was lifting weight all the way to the bottom. It's like, for the most part, to me, it's a resting position. So I'm okay with actually, like, even if my hips don't have a ton of room to get down there and I round my low back, I'm okay with that for a short period as I rest, because when you're in an anterior tilt, okay, your joints are coming together at the back. Like, they're actually slamming together and they're locking up so you can move. So you're all day, if you're in a good anterior tilt, those are locking up. It's nice to have a little bit of a break with them, to be able to let them relax. So to me, when it's unweighted, it's not that big of a deal. When it's weighted, this is a different story. Okay. Because I mean, I know weightlifters do it, but theoretically your back is literally rounding with a ton of weight on it. That can only last for so long, right? To me, you can buffer it in your 20s and 30s, 40s. You don't see a lot of old lifters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that one?
Yeah, well, just I love that point of, like, you don't see a lot of old lifters. Power lifters, sometimes you do. You can see some older power lifters who who sustain some degree of lifting. You get those, like, videos of the 90-year-old men deadlifting 300 pounds and stuff. But who knows how they're moving in the rest of their life, right? I think it's really interesting to look at elders and see how they're still moving. Like, a lot of yogi elders tend to be extremely hypermobile or need joint or like hip replacements or knee replacements. Elder gymnasts sometimes have an okay time, but they usually have some joint issues as well, just probably from overuse. So looking at elders and how they move is a really, really fascinating exercise in understanding how the specific adaptations to their imposed demands affected them long term. And that's a tricky thing too, right? Because different people, like, there's a gazillion different variables in how a person ages and how a person's lifestyle outside of just their training input. Like, you can't be like, oh, this person did gymnastics and now they're a fucking crippled old man. Like, you can't exactly do that, because there could be a gazillion other factors ranging from genetic to lifestyle that could affect how their body ages over time, right? But I think that is something to consider, is like, look at some elders and see how they're still moving, right? And that's in terms of GOTA, that's what they're trying to reverse engineer. They're looking at the elders and they're seeing what consistencies in their movement patterns they have with, like, some of the best athletes in the world and some of the tribes that are long lasting injury free movers, and they're trying to see the consistency patterns. And that's why I really like GOTA, is they're observing actual movement, right? We've talked about that a lot. I think I do have to wrap this up, unfortunately, and which is a shame, because I feel like we could just keep going on these topics every
We need
day.
a part 2 for sure.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2, but this was episode 61 of The Art of Move, the said principle squats and Batman, how we would train Batman. I love this episode, actually. This was super fun. Check us out again. We'll probably do another episode this week. Thanks for listening, guys, on YouTube. Hit that like and subscribe. Leave us a comment with what you want to hear and what you think we should talk about next. If you're listening on Spotify and iTunes, leaving a rating and review really, really helps us. And if you're interested in learning more from us, you want to get a little more in-depth stuff, Will and I actually do have a course. You can find it at aomfoundations.com. That is still up, and we're going to be updating it a lot this summer. So if you buy it now, you'll get unlimited updates for as long as you have it. And even if we change the price, we won't charge you for all the extra content. So you can still buy that at aomfoundations.com. We already put about 100 hours of work into it with all of our best stuff that we had up to this point. And over the summer, we're going to be updating it with all the stuff that we learned from other guests and our own personal exploration. We're going to have even more content in there, so you can check that out. Follow me at The Body Moves on Instagram. Will is at The Art of Move. And thank you for listening again, guys. This is just super, super fun that we're part of this discussion with you. And we'll see you next time.
Have a good one, guys.